Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Eternal Palace. I did give my final thoughts on this, but Blizzard has saw fit to continue the testing. Not surprising, considering how unusual the Queen Azshara fight was on our first little look at it. Even though the patch is coming this week, and very shortly after that the bosses are going to be arriving with it, they decided to test it a little bit more with the heroic Queen Azshara fight and see if they can nail that one down, because it is way out there in terms of how difficult that thing actually is. Although I will put some caveats out here, is that we are scaled to 415 gear, which is way lower than you're supposed to be doing this fight in. Everything in heroic drops 430 plus. We're going to have an abundance of gear sources from outside of the raid to go and grab, so by the time you guys reach Queen Azshara, you'll obviously have substantially more gear. And in fact, that wasn't really what we were testing. The reason they give us such low gear, of course, is that we don't just smash the boss to pieces and don't provide any feedback. They want to see how the mechanics are actually dealt with and see if, more to the point, we come up with any ingenious strategies in order to try and get around what they're trying to produce in the fight. So we generally do it on a much harder difficulty than what it actually will be on live. Now, as I have done the full normal mode and done the heroic Queen Azshara again, I think it's time to revisit this, because I kind of had a sour taste in my mouth about the Eternal Palace. It was a mixed bag. It was very much all over the place. And I mentioned the phrase one boss raid, which drew some ire from some of you who were a little confused as to what I meant by that. Certainly some people who misremembered what happened in the Battle for Azshara in terms of the one boss raid. And a one boss raid to me is where essentially you spend multiples more time on one boss than the entire rest of the instance combined. And that's what we've had on a number of occasions, and that comes with it with certain drawbacks. What we've seen in the past, and is becoming more and more commonplace, and something I think needs to die, is the final boss of heroic being so difficult that many guilds actually choose to go into mythic instead, and even pug people from outside of the guild in order to get more gear in order to defeat the heroic boss. Now, I'm sure some of you will think that doesn't seem that bad. I mean, you're just collecting gear, right? And you're going into a harder difficulty. But it does raise questions for me about heroic-only guilds. I know from conversations with those guys, they're really not happy about having to go into a harder difficulty and, in fact, bring in randoms in order to acquire the gear to complete their chosen difficulty, even though many might argue you should still be able to do it. But as we know, heroic is a scaled flex version. So if you have less players, heroic can be substantially more difficult than what other teams are facing, even though they have chosen the same difficulty. So there's all kinds of different issues that come up with having an exceedingly hard last boss, especially if it doesn't fit the level of difficulty that's within the rest of the raid. If you're finding, let's say, the 9 bosses that are coming up in the Eternal Palace, that you can smash 8 bosses in about an hour and a half, which is actually what happens, yet the last boss is going to take you many days or even many hours to get down, then that's not right. That's not the way it should really be. But it is something that I imagine Blizzard's working on, because they don't. This has happened too often. We've had it with Kil'jaeden, Archimonde especially, where people were going into Mythic and clearing a few bosses, and of course in Battle for Azshara, where Jaina Proudmoore was considerably more difficult than many other bosses, and therefore people chose to go and do Jade Fire Masters, Grong, and the Champion of Light on Mythic to pick up some much better gear than they can acquire from Jaina on Heroic, and then go back and actually kill Jaina. So that was my big worry with the Eternal Palace. They've done some rejigging. They have reworked a number of these bosses. It is normal mode, but again, some caveats here. They want us to test this properly, so our gear was scaled down to 405 for the normal mode. Yeah, 405, which is really, really low. It's like 10 or 15 item levels lower than what normal drops and what you can access easily by actually just going to Nazjatar will give you like a 415 weapon. So exceedingly low gear. What I can say is that we pretty much one-shot everything. It wasn't that difficult at all, but wasn't supposed to be. I mean, this is a bunch of Mythic Raiders doing normal, right? Even under geared. If you can deal with mechanics, you're probably going to be okay. We did not kill Zaqul, sorry, which is the 8th boss in the dungeon. Now, that doesn't mean we couldn't have killed it. We absolutely could have. In fact, we had it to like 8% and just made a bit of an incorrect call amongst ourselves, which led to the wipe. So our strategy was nailed down for this. But what I can say is this probably isn't going to be, in my estimation, certainly on the Mythic World First race, I know many of you are probably looking forward to, a one-boss raid again. We could be looking at something particularly difficult, namely in Zaqul, which I did not give enough credit to this fight. What I can say is that once we figured it out, and there is a lot going on here, and it does, again, I have to be clear on this, it does feel slightly out of place with the other bosses that are in there, which have very few mechanics for the most part. Like, you look at Lady Ashvane and Orgazoa, the Radiance of Azshara, the Blackwater Behemoth, and of course Abyssal Commander Savara. They generally have something like 3 or 4 mechanics. There's more listed in the Dungeon Journal, but for the most part you have like 3 or 4 mechanics that you're really looking at. In fact, I'm actually browsing the Dungeon Journal now. There's very few things that actually happen in those fights. They're quite simplistic fights to get your head around and understand what's happening and deal with. And also, I think this is very important, the mechanics that you do deal with are really clear. It's really quite obvious what you're supposed to do. It's not hidden away. Everything's nice and bright. It's very obvious what which is an issue I've had recently when we talked about the Restless Cabal, where we're in a very dark room with very dark purple bosses that do a lot of very dark purple mechanics. I find it quite irritating not to be able to just clearly see what's happening. However, by the time you get past the Queen's Court and head into Zaqul, it just magnifies massively. Like, the amount of mechanics you got to deal with here is pretty intense. And also, I will point this out now, because again, Blizzard might change this to make it easier. Really not pug-friendly, like, at all. And normal mode, for me, is what should be puggable. I actually have a problem with Heroic being puggable. I think Heroic is where you should be looking for a well-communicated team to be working together, and then for the really good players, they move up to Mythic. But normal mode Zaqul, at least if it stays this way, again, gear's a deficit. You might end up just crunching through this boss. It's not a big deal. So I will point that out there before people do crunch through it and they go in their 415, 420 gear to like, it wasn't that hard, Mike. It's like, well, yeah, you did, you know, in a considerably further item level than we did. But there's a lot going on here, and not a lot of it is super clear. They have made it easier where you move between the realms here. I'm not trying to do a guide on this or anything like that. But what you have that's the interesting thing that makes it slightly unpuggable are these 2 factors. The boss has 2 different sets of timers going. One is based on when you started the fight, and he'll just continue to do them. We'll call them the core mechanics, at least that's what our guys called it. And then when he changes phases, of which he has 4 phases, he has different timers that start whenever he enters those phases. So that's obviously based on your damage when you transition him. And that leads you to having to adapt and work around when that happened, because slight delays, even by a few seconds, can really sort of shift when you want to do things like Bloodlust, when you want to move people between realms, because you are actively shifting people between realms. Very much like Calicos, for any of you who have been to the Sunwell either to farm Transmog or did the Sunwell at the time, and Halion, where you are moving people between realms in order to get various tasks done. So a lot of that going on with Zaqul. On top of that, you have an interesting mechanic where the tanks have to consistently move the boss to a very specific area of the room, yet that specific area can only be seen in one of the 3 realms that you're actually dealing with. So you can do that in a number of ways. You do have choices. You can move a tank down very quickly. You can leave the tanks in there, but they will gain a stacking damage buff. You can have a DPS go down and see where it is and then mark it with a raid marker or something like that. But it does happen, like, very, very regularly. So that's not that pug friendly, because you're going to have people shifting between the Delirium realm, the Fear realm, the Normal realm, all swapping between them. And you do realistically, unless you very, very, very much outgear this fight, you do need to be swapping people between these realms. It's one of the fights I'm most looking forward to now on Mythic, because it's really fun. It's very, very fun to do, because you're on your toes all the time with things changing and moving around, being aware of your position and making sure you're leaving, say, damaging pools that some people will leave on the floor, yet the other realms can't see where they are. So you do have to bear in mind and say, give yourself little rules to say, like, well, if you're downstairs and you can't see the pools, you should come out in certain areas, because the people who can drop the pools are going to be dropping them in certain areas in order to make sure that you don't overlap each other and end up getting killed. As you can see, it happened to me a couple of times where some random pools just happened to be underneath me. I couldn't see them, and they kill you pretty goddamn quickly, even on normal mode. So, very exciting. Let's move on to Queen Azshara herself, though. This fight is a beast. Oh, dearie me. If you thought Zaqul had a lot going on, which you will when you get there, Queen Azshara has a lot going on. This isn't Mythic Unat by any means, and we have only tested the heroic version, but good God almighty, yet less fun than Zaqul, unfortunately. Why am I saying that? I'll be honest with you guys. The line of sight mechanic that this fight employs, and it employs it in nearly every single one of the individual mechanics that this fight has, is something that I'm going to struggle to get over how irritating it is. You can do quite a lot to negate it by considering your position constantly within the room, but there are lots of dynamic actions that happen in the fight where ads will go a certain way. You can account for, say, 2 out of 3 positions it'll go in, but of course it'll end up going to the third one. Where things are being moved, and of course the boss can change the shape of the room, or at least the layout of the room, as the fight goes on, which means you're constantly having to modify and move around. And you're just forever, it does feel like you're forever chasing your tail, trying to get into line of sight. You can see everything, you know what you need to do, but ultimately you've just kind of got to double around a little bit. The fight is interesting. I would say it's a little mechanic heavy, and that might seem odd coming from me. I understand that, but they've put in a lot of tiny little mechanics, and there's a lot of them. There really is. If you check the Dungeon Journal, when either by being on the PTR or on 8.2, you'll see an absolute just array of stuff this boss can do. And it's really quite intimidating, I've got to be honest with you guys, where you're dealing with a lot of very minor things, but there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of them. And it's all happening all the time, and not a lot of them are particularly interesting. I will say, though, on a good note, is the Queen's Decree mechanic, which is probably going to be the primary stumbling block of most people, which happens during the intermission, so you have to deal with this twice as she changes phase. If you're not sure what this mechanic is, she will give you a command, a decree, and she'll give you 1 or 2 commands to do. And at the same time, you have to soak these arcane orbs that she spawns in there, and any unsoaked orbs will AoE and kill everybody. And these are things like stand still. Run around, but be with other people. Don't stop moving. Don't move. Soak an orb on your own. Soak an orb with other people. And all this happens in the space of about 10 seconds. Is you've got to coordinate the entire raid to make sure this happens. And it seems on the face of it, you probably think, well, that doesn't sound too hard. It's a little tricky on many occasions because this is a fight that's going to come down to having weak auras. I mean, during our testing, and they did give us 2 hours to test this, which is an hour longer than normal. And no doubt they're seeing exactly what kind of strategies people were coming up with. We ended up just making a weak aura to spam the entire raid chat, very similar actually to Mythic Utnat, in order to clearly identify which people were doing what as fast as possible. And that's even after they have added really good quality graphics to help out with this. But there's actually a rare complaint from me. But I think other people are going to run into this. The screen, while you're actually doing this fight, with so many mechanics going on, a lot of them are arcane, which, as you know, comes with a lot of purple and pink and all that kind of stuff, and explosions and debuffs and rings and swirls. It's extremely busy, and some of you could probably see that in the background right now, is just how busy your screen is all the time. It's a little overwhelming, like, so even look at it, it just looks like a big spaghetti mess with everything going on, especially with all the new essences and things like that that are happening. Now, it is something you could probably counter by just turning your graphics down, but that's not something I like to do. I mean, I understand it in competitive, like, FPS games. I just want as many frames as possible, but with World of Warcraft, I certainly don't expect to have to turn my graphics down because there's just so much going on my screen. But it's certainly an option I have, and certainly an option many other people probably have as well. It's just not something I personally enjoy. I've never had to do it in the past, but I did notice while doing this, it's like, wow, there's a lot happening here. There's lasers and beams and explosions and all this kind of stuff going on, and it's a little bit overwhelming. But as you can probably tell, I'm much happier. I'm happier to look at a raid that doesn't look like it's going to be squashed, and then we're going to spend 2 weeks on Queen Azshara. As I said, I'm just to throw some numbers out here. For Battle to Dazzle Allure, it is considered to be a one-boss raid for the most part because Jaina is so significantly more difficult than everything else. Even some people thought that the World First Guilds actually took hundreds of pulls to kill the other stuff, which isn't true. Now, I will point out here, of course, looking at the World First Guilds for some indication of how long it might take you to clear a boss is utterly ridiculous. The sheer amount of preparation and time these guys throw at it during the actual race is astronomical compared to what a normal guild will do. But even there, you can see that everything died besides Stormwall Blockade on the first day, and Stormwall Blockade fell very early the very next morning. And then Lady Proudmoore took Method 5 days to kill. The World's Second, which was Limits, actually went up to take 7 days just to kill Jaina. So they killed absolutely everything day one besides Stormwall Blockade, killed Stormwall Blockade very early the next day, and then spent 7 days after that killing Lady Jaina. And if you go down to even, say, World 40th or something like that, you'll see that that 7 days turns into weeks just spent on that one boss. That's what we would consider a one-boss raid, because for the most part, you're just kind of farming 8 or 9 bosses, right? 8 bosses, 9 bosses that were in Battle for Azshara, but you're farming 8 bosses that aren't holding your interest particularly because they're not that difficult. They weren't that difficult the first time. They're certainly not that difficult when you're on farm. And then spending just an absurd amount of time on one particular boss. That's not something that I find particularly enjoyable, and know many others don't. However, the counter to that, and maybe this is where I can get your opinions on this, is there are a lot of people who do like that. And who likes that? The guys who get to get 8 bosses worth of loot pretty goddamn quickly, and then are part of guilds which are becoming increasingly common that just don't bother with the last boss until they're pretty much gear capped. That's happening more and more as people who eventually want their ahead of the curve or the cutting edge or whatever it is for heroic actually just chill. No need to do it. We saw that with Gahoon, we saw that with Jane Proudmore, and it's maybe something we're going to see again with Queen Azshara, although it does look like a Mr. Zaqul is going to be showing his face. So there you go. I feel better about the Eternal Palace. It's shaping up to be a much better raid. They even changed the Blackwater Behemoth, by the way. It's still garbage, but still, they are trying something to try and keep your interest in it. It definitely looks like a boss you're supposed to kind of 1 or 2 shot your first time and then never wipe on again, but they are trying to do something to make it nice. Thank you very much, ladies and gents. I'll see you in the raid. Bye-bye.